Hello and welcome back to Modern World History with Dustin Fowler. Today we're gonna start looking at the French Revolution. Now, really, what this unit is all about is the revolutions that would happen as a result of enlightened thinking. And so, up until this point, we've seen this kind of a clash between new ideas through the Renaissance, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Age of Exploration, the Protestant Reformation, and we've also seen this attempt at monarchs through absolutism to kind of really rein in what's going on and hold everyone fast to an old style of government and society. And so what the French Revolution quite literally is, and many of these other revolutions, is going to serve as a point by which those two ideas come together and change happens. And so when you look at revolution, revolution itself is a word for, I want to shrink this down just a smidge. Revolution itself is a word for a sudden, drastic change. All right. So in this case, the sudden change is going to be a new government, right? The American Revolution was a change where the English colonies went from being colonies to now being a new American government. The Scientific Revolution was a change where in a relatively short amount of time, people started to use observation and reason in order to guide their new understanding of the world around them, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So what we're going to look at here is the French Revolution. I'll shrink this down just a little bit more. All right. The French Revolution is going to be a change in government. So France at the time of this revolution, going into the late 1700s, was a pretty prosperous and strong kingdom. We've already talked about how you've got powerful kings like Louis XIV, who, even though he left a ton of debt in his wake, the French empire was pretty strong at the time. But Enlightenment ideas were contradictory to the government that was currently in place, and nothing could be more problematic for that system than the idea of the social class structure. And so, if you look at this image here, this is straight from the textbook. But if you look at this image, you can see something in particular when you look right here. All right, and that is that the population is made up of 3 different estates: the first, second, and third. And whatever the third estate is, they are paying the vast majority of French income taxes. And they also make up the vast majority of the people in the country. Okay, and so let's break it down. Let's see what's going on here. First and second estate, they're the ones that have all the power in society. They're going to belong to, the first estate was the Roman Catholic clergy, and the second estate was the nobility, and they paid no taxes and held all power and owned all of the land. Now, the third estate, even though it makes up the vast majority of the population, it could be broken down into several different categories in and of itself. And so if you weren't nobility and you weren't clergy, you belonged in the third estate. And so the most influential part of the third estate, not the majority of them, but the most influential part, was known as the bourgeoisie. And and the bourgeoisie would have been the equivalent to what a middle class was. So they were a small group, but they were also really well educated. All right, they were hardworking, so their success was merit based. They had to work hard for their success, and they couldn't just leave an inheritance to someone who wasn't willing to pick up with that hard work. And some of them were as rich as the aristocracy. In other words, they were as rich in some cases as some of these members of the second estate, but they still paid taxes, and it wasn't fair for them. And they were also looked down upon by the aristocracy. So when we think about the enlightened thinkers, the philosophers that we discussed in the last video, this right here is the class of people that they come from. Okay, so philosophers, and we're going to say enlightened thinkers, enlightened thinkers. All right, they all came from the bourgeoisie, and so peasants still make up the vast majority of the third estate. they could not afford food under this system. So going into the late 1700s, there was a brief period, almost like a mini ice age that caused the harvests to be really, really bad, and the political and economic system in France was so poorly managed that taxes went through the roof, and the price of bread was like an entire month's worth of wages. There wasn't enough for everyone, so they had riots in the streets. The Third Estate believed themselves to be the people of the state, and as we've already learned from studying people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and John Locke, we know that they were the ones that philosophers believed should have the power. And so let's take a look a little bit more deeply. I already kind of just said this stuff, but France had economic problems. They had this mini ice age. Their winters were very, very bad at this time. It caused bad harvests and food shortages. There was France's population had been growing. You know, whenever there's prosperity, there's usually going to be an increase of population, but this also equaled more mouths to feed in the wake of all these food shortage issues. And bread ends up costing just a tremendous amount of money for these poor peasants. And so meanwhile, let's look back at the royal family. At this point, it's Louis XVI is going to become the king. He was a very young monarch, not prepared to lead, really had no idea what he was doing. He was clueless and indecisive. His wife, Marie Antoinette, this right here was an arranged marriage. She was Austrian, and she, I guess in order to I don't know, be happy or whatever, in whatever royal life she lived, she had unbelievably terrible spending habits where she would just waste away tremendous loads of money. Robespierre, we're going to learn is basically the father of the Enlightenment, accused her of having spent enough money on her own, I guess, lavish lifestyle that she could have fed whole villages or fed everyone in the country for a year. She also had a nickname. Her nickname was Madame Deficit, because they considered her like pretty much the reason for the economic problems in the country, the reason for all the debt issues they were dealing with. So really, what she does is she is a symbol of the I guess the royal lifestyle, if you will. So she came to symbolize many of the problems that the philosophes were trying to highlight in their philosophies and in their writings and things like this. So she represented the problems in governments like this. And also, it's important to note, I mentioned this in a previous video, that the royals lived in Versailles. They did not live in Paris. All right, so Versailles, if you remember from several videos ago when we looked at Louis XIV, Versailles was where the Palace of Versailles is built, and that's where the monarchs lived, and that's also where the royal court was. So all the nobles that served the monarchs lived in Versailles with them as part of what Louis XIV had established as absolute ruler of France. So Louis XVI decided that he was going to tax the nobility in order to offset this major debt problem that they were dealing with, but the nobles resisted. They're like, heck no, because look at this. We already know that nobles, they don't pay taxes in the Second Estate, so there is no way they're going to allow this king to tax them. They don't deserve to be taxed. So they ended up calling the Estates General, which is going to be like their legislative assembly. And this is the first time this has happened in 175 years. Remember, absolute monarchs wanted to handle all their problems on their own. So there was never a need for the Estates General to be called until now. We see that Louis XVI is in need of finances. In order to fix their problem, he's going to have to enlist their help. So the Estates General works like this. The First and Second Estate and Third Estate all join together as one, representing the country, and they try to hash out all the problems they have and figure out a way around them. But they represent very different groups of people, and usually the First and Second Estate are going to agree on a lot of these things. So So what they did was the first and the second could always outvote the third estate, because even though the third estate had so many more members, representing 97% of the population, um, they had the same degree of representation in the estates general. Each one of them would have like basically one vote or so, and so the second and third would always team up. I'm sorry, first and second would always team up against the third estate, and so it got so crazy. They tried to make voting more fair in their favor, but they were shot down, and the king obviously is going to side with the first and second estate, and so what happens is the bourgeoisie and the third estate, they met in a completely different location and formed what they call the National Assembly. The third estate voted themselves into a lawmaking body, which really, this right here is going to be an act of revolution. Technically, this would be treasonous, all right? So, essentially, they locked themselves, well, I guess 3 days after this, they were locked out of their meeting room and then went next door to an indoor tennis court, all right, and made what we know as the tennis court oath. And this here is kind of a big deal, because this really is what we're going to consider the start of the revolution, because what they did was all of these individuals representing the third estate went into this tennis court and vowed that they wouldn't leave until they made a constitution by which they can establish a new government that actually represents the people. So remember, we were talking about this. This right here is very much according to the philosophy of people like John Locke and Rousseau, for example. But John Locke was like, overthrow your empire, your leader, if it doesn't represent the rights of the people there. It doesn't protect their natural rights. So rumors of feared military retaliation ended up leading to a mob of Parisians storming the Bastille. Now, the Bastille here is going to be a symbol of absolute power, a symbol of the monarchy. It kind of stood to remind the people that if you fell out of line, you would be sent to this prison, because it was a prison, where you would be tortured. You could be sometimes you go in and you don't come out. It really truly was a symbol of this is what happens if you don't comply. And for the people to go there, storm this Bastille, and obtain weapons there and break it down physically with their hands, brick by brick, it is a symbol of the Leviathan, all right, the Leviathan being overcome by the people. So here's the thing: is Leviathan was like a sea creature, all right, sea creature, and Thomas Hobbes said that an absolute monarch needs to be like the Leviathan, if you're an absolute king. So I didn't put this into the video about that had Thomas Hobbes last time. I don't know why I didn't do that, but you need to know this, because this mythical sea monster had, I mean, you can't just go up and fight Leviathan and live to tell the tale. He is an indestructible sea monster. You can find pictures of people trying to face off Leviathan in many legends and even video games today. You hear about Leviathan being this massive water spirit that you can call on to do your bidding with the proper magic. But the fact is, Thomas Hobbes used this as an analogy to represent the unstoppable force of the absolute monarch. And so this really is, the storming of the Bastille really is a symbol of the defeat of Leviathan, the defeat of the absolute monarch. So soon after this, you've got the Great Fear, which is basically news of the rebellion, and rebellion itself had begun to kind of spread to the countryside, and peasants were freaking out because they were afraid that nobles were out hiring outlaws in order to kill and terrorize them. And so they responded by basically rebelling against their feudal lords, and they would run in, kill nobles, and they would burn down manor houses. You've got these Parisian women that marched on Versailles in protest of the high prices of bread. When they got to Versailles, they actually infiltrated, carrying these knives, and got as far as where Marie Antoinette was staying, and she had only just narrowly escaped or she would have perhaps met her doom right then and there. But Louis and Marie were forced at that point to move to Paris to live among the people and in order to meet their demands. So on August the 4th, 1789, nobles began committing themselves to liberty and equality. It's really in an effort to protect themselves from the possible ramifications of adhering to the old way. So at this point, the old regime, as it's called, is effectively done. So everything that existed under the absolute monarchs and the way things were, where nobility called the shots, is at this point just a done deal. And so that brings us to the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which is like a manifesto, if you will, that kind of just is the central idea here is that men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. It didn't even highlight women, so very sorry, ladies, about that. But the idea here is that regardless of class, people are born and remain free and equal in their rights. And so that's revolutionary in and of itself. So you can see that this is the breeding, I guess, the beginning of a brand new style of government. The National Assembly takes control of the church. Church officials at this point need to be elected. The Catholic Church lost land and power in France due to this, and the proceeds from this, the revenue they gain from selling off the land of the Catholic Church, it goes towards paying off France's unbelievable debt, which, you know, this move really offended many devout Catholics of all classes. So they were okay. A lot of the bourgeoisie, for example, or a lot of the third estate might have been okay with the revolutionary ideas, but they were not so okay with mess with Catholicism, so to speak. So Louis and Marie Antoinette, they literally tried to leave and go to Austria, where the Austrians, remember Marie Antoinette was an Austrian princess, they were hoping that they would be able to get protection and support from the Austrian monarch in order to basically rein in what's going on here and retain power. But they got really close to the border, and the king gets identified, and so the people feel betrayed. They bring the king back, and at this point, the National Assembly is going to further reduce the power of the monarch. They're going to create a limited monarchy with a legislative assembly, and essentially they're going to force the king to go along with these things. Some people had mixed feelings about this, and so you start to see this differing in political ideology that began to emerge during this time period. And these terms, right, left, and center, still mean something today, different in world politics from what they mean in American politics, but nevertheless, it's centered on the same basic idea. Conservatives are going to be people that want to keep things more or less the way they've always been. Don't want to mess around with it too much. Why mess it up if it's not broken? Liberals want to change everything in the way of making some kind of progress. So they want to fix whatever might be wrong. They want to elevate whatever people might be oppressed, and they always want to make changes to things. They're looking out in this case for the greater good of everyone, and they think that they need a complete change. And people in the center, they may want some elements of the monarchy, and they may want some elements of reform, but they didn't want a complete overhaul of the system that they had in place. And so even today, you can kind of see those things in our government today when you start looking at American politics as well as politics abroad. So the further right you are, the more you want to keep things the same. The further left, the more you want to change it all. Okay, so other countries began to freak out as well. They feared that revolutionary ideas might reach their country, and that their people may respond very similarly to their absolute rulers. They also demanded that France restore Louis the 16th as the king, and so they declared, France preemptively declared war on these other countries that was neighboring their borders. Prussia advanced on Russia and warned against harming the royal families. Essentially said it would be really, really bad if they brought any harm to their royal family. And therefore, France sent troops that were stationed in Paris to help out with the war, kind of leaving Paris open. Parisians were afraid that nobles would break out of jail and take back control. And so they stormed prisons, and again, they were killing thousands of nobles here. And so you've got these third estate individuals killing nobles for fear that they may want to try to take back France. So the Legislative Assembly suspended the new constitution, created a national convention, and then declared France a republic. So at this point, they're going to try Louis XVI and found him guilty of treason and execute him. So once again, just like it was with Oliver Cromwell when he killed James, this is unheard of. All right, unheard of. Even the United States is like, wow, we just got done with our own revolution, but that's crazy stuff right there. And they start thinking that maybe the French have taken it a little too far, but nevertheless, that's what they did. So now France is completely non-monarchy anymore, limited or absolute. They're a republic, and they ended up having their king, Louis XVI, killed. So due to the length of this material and how long this video has already gone, I'm going to cut it off there, and we're going to pick up and find out what happens next in the next video. Thank you for watching.